The first thing I remember about Egypt is the color of the dust. It wasn't brown or yellow, not really. It was the color of old parchment, the color of a lion's mane in the sun, and it got into everything. It was in my hair, in the creases of my clothes, in the bread we ate. My father, who was a man of maps and measurements, called it alluvial sediment, but to me, it was just the taste of this strange, hot land General Bonaparte had dragged us all to. We were in a town called Rashid, which the soldiers, in their usual way of chewing up foreign words and spitting them out French, called Rosetta. It was July of 1799, and the heat was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered you the moment you stepped out of the shade. Flies droned a constant, lazy song, and the air smelled of the Nile, a thick, sweet rot smell of mud and life and decay all mixed together along with baking bread and the sharp tang of donkey dung. My father, Jean-Luc, was one of the savants, the scholars who had come with the army. While the soldiers were there to fight the Mamelukes and chase the English, my father and his friends were there to measure, to sketch, to collect, and to understand. Their war was with ignorance, he'd say, his eyes shining behind his spectacles. They were mapping the bones of a dead empire. Most days, I'd trail after him, a boy of 12 with a sketchbook and a piece of charcoal, feeling very small and pale next to the sun-darkened soldiers and the lean, watchful Egyptians. The soldiers were busy turning an old Mameluke fort into something they could defend. They called it Fort Julian. It was a miserable, crumbling place on the west bank of the Nile, a few miles from the sea. I'd often go there to sketch, not the fort itself, but the feluccas with their tall, triangular sails that looked like shark fins cutting through the muddy water, or the date palms that drooped in the heat as if they were exhausted. The soldiers mostly ignored me. I was just the cartographer's boy, another piece of civilian baggage. That's where I was on the day it happened. I was sitting on an overturned crate, trying to capture the way the light hit the ripples in the river, when a great shout went up from the northern wall of the fort. It wasn't a cry of alarm, not a warning of an attack, but a shout of surprise. Men stopped their digging and hauling. A silence fell, broken only by the ever-present flies and the lapping of the river. I saw Lieutenant Bouchard, a man with a practical face and hands permanently calloused from his sword and tools, jogging towards the commotion. I grabbed my sketchbook and followed, my curiosity a stronger pull than the shade. A group of soldiers was crowded around a hole in the old wall they were demolishing. They were talking excitedly, pointing. As I squeezed through the dusty, sweat-smelling men, I saw it. Lying half buried in the rubble was a slab of stone. It wasn't like the other sandy-colored blocks of the fort. This one was dark, a deep gray-black like a stormy sky, and it glittered in the sun as if it had tiny stars trapped inside. "Look at this, sir," one of the soldiers said to Bouchard, his voice full of awe. "There's writing on it." Bouchard knelt down, pulling a rag from his belt to wipe away the centuries of grime. The men grew quiet again, leaning in. I pushed closer, peering over a soldier's shoulder. The surface of the stone was covered in marks, neat and precise. But it wasn't just one kind of writing. At the top, there were the pictures I'd seen on the ruins my father loved so much: tiny birds and eyes and wavy lines for water, and seated figures of gods and kings. The hieroglyphs. Below that was a script I didn't recognize, a flurry of intricate loops and dashes that looked like frantic handwriting. And below that, at the very bottom, was something that made my breath catch. It was Greek. I knew a little Greek. My father had insisted on it. I could pick out letters: alpha, beta, sigma. "Mon Dieu," Bouchard whispered. He wasn't a man for prayers or wonder. He was a man of earthworks and cannon placements. But even he could see this was something else. That evening, the stone was the only topic of conversation. It had been carefully loaded onto a cart and brought to my father's quarters, which we shared with a botanist and an architect. It took up half the room, a silent, heavy guest that radiated a strange coldness in the sweltering night. My father and the other savants circled it like wolves, their faces lit by the flickering oil lamps. They didn't touch it, not at first. They just stared, their minds racing. The same text, in 3 languages, my father murmured, his hand hovering over the Greek section. His voice was trembling with an excitement I had never heard before. Ptolemy, a decree. Greek, the language of the rulers. Demotic, the language of the people. He pointed to the script in the middle. And this, his finger moved to the top. The sacred script. The language of the gods. He looked at his friends, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated joy. Don't you see? It's a key. It's a dictionary carved in granite. For centuries, the hieroglyphs have been mute. We look upon them and see only pictures. But this stone will make them speak. For the next few weeks, that stone was the sun around which our little world orbited. The savants were consumed. They brought in artists to make perfect copies. They developed a special kind of ink and used great rolls of paper to make rubbings, carefully pressing the dampened sheets onto the stone's surface to capture every single mark. The air in our quarters was constantly thick with the smell of ink and damp paper and the focused, humming silence of men who believed they were on the verge of greatness. I was tasked with small things, keeping the ink pots full, making sure the lamps didn't smoke. But mostly, I watched. I watched my father's face, etched with concentration, as he traced the lines with his finger, whispering Greek phrases to himself. I saw the way his whole body tensed when he thought he'd found a corresponding word in the demotic script. To them, the stone was everything. It was the voice of a lost world, a bridge across 3,000 years. To me, it was a big, cold rock that smelled faintly of old earth and made the adults forget about everything else, including me. Boredom is a powerful force in a boy's life. With my father obsessed, I was left to my own devices. It was during this time that I met Yosef. I was down by the market, trying to sketch a man selling melons from a brightly painted cart, when a date pit hit me square on the back of the head. I spun around to see a boy my age, with dark, clever eyes and a grin that showed a missing front tooth. He wasn't wearing the worn-out wool of the soldiers or the linen suits of the savants, but a simple, loose-fitting galabaya that had seen better days. He said something in Arabic, pointing at my sketchbook. I shook my head, managing the one word I knew. Francais. His grin widened. He pointed to himself. Yosef. I pointed to myself. Pierre. And just like that, we were friends. Language wasn't the barrier I thought it would be. We communicated in gestures, in drawings in the dust, in shared laughter. Yosef knew Rosetta in a way I never could. He showed me the best places to catch small, silvery fish in the canals with a net woven from reeds. He taught me how to climb the gnarled sycamore fig trees to get the sweetest fruit. He showed me the hidden courtyards where women baked flatbread on hot stones, the air filled with the most wonderful, comforting smell. His Rosetta had nothing to do with ancient kings or forgotten languages. It was alive. It was the cackle of chickens scattering underfoot, the rhythmic thump-thump of a coppersmith's hammer, the sing-song cry of the water seller with his goatskin bag. It was the taste of sugar cane chewed straight from the stalk and the cool, Silty feel of Nile mud between my toes. One afternoon, I brought him to see the stone. I was proud of it, in a way. It was my world, the thing that made my father so important. Yosef walked into our quarters, his bare feet silent on the stone floor. He looked at the great slab, at the savants hunched over their rubbings, and he wrinkled his nose. I pointed to it, trying to explain. Hieroglyphs, I said, drawing a little bird in the air. Greek. I traced a big A. I pointed from one to the other, trying to convey the idea of the same. Yosef looked at the stone for a long moment. Then he shrugged. He picked up a loose pebble from the floor and, with a flick of his wrist, skipped it perfectly across a puddle outside the doorway. He looked back at me and grinned, as if to say, "That's interesting, but this is fun." I tried to explain it to him later, drawing pictures in the dust. A king. A law. A stone to tell everyone. Yosef understood. He nodded, then drew his own picture, a farmer, a water buffalo, and a sun. He pointed to the farmer, then to himself. His meaning was clear. The decrees of long-dead kings meant little to a boy whose life was governed by the rise and fall of the river and the heat of the sun. The stone was just another relic the foreigners were fussing over, like the broken statues and crumbling temples. It was part of a past that had nothing to do with the urgent, vibrant present of being alive. I started to see the stone through his eyes. A dead king's shopping list, he might have called it if he had the words. And I saw my father and the others through his eyes, too. Men so obsessed with a dead language that they couldn't see the living, breathing world right outside their door. It didn't make me love my father any less, but it planted a new thought in my mind. There was more than one way to understand a place. You could measure its ruins, or you could taste its figs. The summer wore on, and the heat did not break. The news from the war wasn't good. We heard whispers of a great sea battle at Aboukir, of the English Navy, of Admiral Nelson. The soldiers in the fort grew tense. They dug their trenches deeper and looked to the sea more often. The savants worked with a new kind of urgency, a frantic energy, as if they knew their time was running out. They packed crates with specimens, pressed flowers, preserved insects, ancient papyri, and they made dozens of copies of the stone's inscription. The ink-stained papers were treated like holy relics. We must preserve the knowledge, Pierre, my father told me one night, his face tired and grey in the lamplight. The artifacts, the stone, they can be taken. But the copies, the information, that can be carried in our minds and in our saddlebags. Knowledge is lighter than stone. The end came not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding defeat. The English and the Ottomans had us trapped. General Menou, who was in charge after Bonaparte had slipped back to France, finally surrendered. It was August 1801. The war in Egypt was over for us. We had lost. The terms of the surrender were harsh. But the cruelest blow for the savants wasn't about territory or prisoners. It was Article 16 of the Capitulation of Alexandria. It stated that all the Egyptian antiquities collected by the French were to be considered public property and handed over to the British. I was there when the English officers, crisp and red-coated and looking unbearably smug in the heat, came to claim the collection. The savants stood together, a small, defiant group of men in dusty linen, their faces grim. My father stood in front of the Rosetta Stone as if he could protect it with his own body. A French naturalist named Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire spoke for them all. His voice shook with rage. "We will not surrender this. You can have our lives, but you cannot have our work. Sooner this collection, this treasure of history, we will burn it all ourselves. He gestured to the crates, to the scrolls, to the great black stone. You can tell your government that they will have nothing but the memory of its ashes. For a moment, a terrible silence hung in the air. The English officer, a major with a face like polished leather, simply stared. I think he genuinely couldn't understand why these men would care so much about a pile of old rocks and dried plants. To him, this was just the spoils of war. To my father, it was the soul of their entire expedition. In the end, of course, they had no choice. The soldiers had laid down their arms. A protest by a few unarmed scholars meant nothing. They managed to negotiate, to keep their personal notes, their research, and crucially, the paper copies of the stone's inscription. But the stone itself, the heavy, magical key, was to be taken. I watched 2 English soldiers and a group of local laborers heave it onto a cart. It scraped against the door frame, and my father flinched as if he'd been struck. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a man whose grandest dream was being carted away by his enemies. The light had gone out of his eyes. The day we were to board the ships for France, I went to find Yosef. I found him by the riverbank, mending a fishing net with his father. There were no grand farewells. We didn't have the words for that. I gave him my last good piece of drawing charcoal, a smooth, dark stick from Paris. He looked at it, then at me. He reached into the pocket of his galabeah and pulled out a small, smooth, grey stone, worn round by the Nile. He pressed it into my palm. His hand was warm and rough. He pointed at the charcoal, then at my sketchbook. Then he pointed at the stone in my hand, and then to the river, and to himself. Remember this, that's what he was saying. Remember me, I nodded, my throat tight. I couldn't speak. We just stood there for a minute under the white sun, 2 boys from different worlds who had shared a summer. Then I turned and walked away, back towards the ships and the soldiers and the defeated scholars, the little river stone growing warm in my fist. The voyage home was long and quiet. My father rarely spoke. He would sit on the deck for hours, staring south, back towards the land that held both his greatest discovery and his greatest disappointment. We returned to a different France, a France of new politics and new ambitions, a France that was quickly forgetting about the disastrous adventure in Egypt. My father went back to his work, but he was a changed man. He published papers based on his notes, he corresponded with other scholars, but the fire I had seen in his eyes that night in Rosetton never fully returned. The stone was gone. Years passed. I grew up. I learned to draw things other than pyramids and palm trees. But I never forgot. I never forgot the color of the dust, or the drone of the flies, or the taste of a stolen fig. And I kept that little gray stone from the Nile in a box on my desk. Then, one day in 1822, long after my father had passed away, news spread like wildfire through the academic circles of Paris. A young man, a genius named Jean-François Champollion, had done it. Working from the ink copies, the very same copies I had watched the savants make in that dusty room in Rosetta, he had cracked the code. He had unlocked the hieroglyphs. He had made the stones of Egypt speak. They said that when he finally figured it out, he burst into his brother's office, cried, "Je tiens mon affaire. I've got it," and promptly fainted, overwhelmed by his discovery. When I heard the news, I didn't feel triumph, not at first. I felt a quiet, profound sadness for my father. He had held the key in his hands but had never gotten to open the door. The French had lost the stone, but a Frenchman had won the intellectual prize. It was a strange, bittersweet victory. People talk about the Rosetta Stone now as a symbol of decipherment, a metaphor for solving any great puzzle. It sits in a museum in London, an object of immense historical value, seen by millions. But when I think of it, I don't see a famous artifact behind glass. I see a dark, cold slab of rock in a hot, lamplit room. I smell ink and dust and the sweet rot of the Nile. I see my father's face, alive with a brilliant, fleeting joy. And I see a boy with a gap-toothed grin, skipping a stone across a puddle, reminding me that the greatest histories are not always the ones carved in granite. Sometimes, they are as small and as simple and as warm as a pebble held in the palm of your hand. The news of Champollion's success arrived in my life not like a thunderclap, but like a slow tide rising. At first, it was just whispers in the salons and lecture halls of Paris, a city that was once again trying to be the center of the world. Then came the pamphlets, the articles in the journals, full of strange and beautiful drawings, the hieroglyphs laid out in neat rows next to their French translations. The bird was not just a bird, it was a letter, a sound. The seated man was not just a man, he was a determinant, a clue to the meaning of the word before it. It was a kind of magic I had not imagined, a spell cast with ink and intellect that had brought a dead world back to life. My own life had settled into a quiet rhythm. I was a man now, with lines around my eyes from squinting at canvases and a touch of gray at my temples. I made a modest living as an illustrator, specializing in architectural drawings and botanical plates. It was precise, careful work, a legacy of my father's influence, I suppose. I had a small apartment in the Latin Quarter, smelling of linseed oil and turpentine, a world away from the dust and the heat of the Nile. But with every new report of Champollion's work, Egypt came rushing back. The past was no longer a locked room, its door had been flung open, and the voices from within were beginning to be heard. I would sit in my armchair at night, the cities hum a distant lullaby, and hold the little grey stone Yusef had given me. It was so smooth, so unremarkable, yet it felt heavier than the grandest monuments. It was my Rosetta Stone. It didn't translate languages, but it translated time. When I held it, I was 12 years old again. I could feel the sun on the back of my neck and taste the grit of sand in my teeth. I could hear Yusef's laugh. The stone unlocked memories, feelings, a whole sensory vocabulary that Champollion's alphabets could never capture. This new revelation, this decipherment, felt incomplete. It was my father's dream, achieved by another man. It was a French victory over an artifact held by the English. But for me, it was a conversation half finished. I had seen the stone when it was mute, a thing of pure potential. Now it was speaking, and I felt a profound, unshakable urge to go and see it again. To stand before it not as a boy watching his father, but as a man who carried his own piece of Egypt in his pocket. The decision solidified over a winter of grey Parisian rain. I saved what money I could, packed a single valise with a change of clothes and several new sketchbooks, and told my clients I was taking a short trip for artistic inspiration. I was going to London. The crossing of the Channel was a wretched affair of grey waves and biting spray. England, when it appeared through the mist, looked exactly as I had imagined, green, damp, and orderly. London was a behemoth, a monster of brick and coal smoke. It was a city of overwhelming sound, the clatter of a million iron-shod hooves on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors in a language that felt thick and clumsy in my ears, the constant, low rumble of industry. It was the complete opposite of Rosetta's sun-baked silence. Here, the air didn't smell of dung and river mud, but of soot and damp wool and roasting meat. I found a room in a boarding house near Bloomsbury, not far from the British Museum. For 2 days, I did nothing but walk, letting the city seep into me. I felt utterly foreign, a ghost from a past conflict, the son of one of Napoleon's defeated scholars walking the streets of the victor. But there was no animosity, only a bustling indifference. I was just another face in the crowd. On the third morning, I knew I could not delay any longer. The sky was the color of slate, threatening a cold drizzle. I walked to the museum, a grand, pillared edifice that looked like a temple to a stern and powerful god. Inside, it was a cavern of echoes and shadows. The air was cool and still, smelling of old stone and floor polish. It was a library of things, a silent kingdom of captured treasures. It was immense, overwhelming. I walked through galleries filled with Greek statues whose blank eyes seemed to follow me, past Roman mosaics that had been torn from the floors of forgotten villas. And then, I saw the signs for the Egyptian sculpture gallery. My heart began to beat a thick, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The room was long and tall, lined with colossal statues of pharaohs and gods. Their granite faces were impassive, their scale designed to make a man feel small and fleeting, and it succeeded. And there, in the center of the gallery, given a place of honor, was the stone. It was not as I remembered it. In Rosetta, it had been a wild thing, a piece of the earth, caked in the dirt of its own history. It lay on our floor, a problem to be solved, radiating a raw and ancient power. Here, it was a specimen. It was mounted upright on a specially made plinth, encased in a heavy iron frame. It was clean, almost polished. The light from the high windows caught the crystalline flecks in its surface, the same glittering I remembered, but it felt different. Tamed. A small crowd of people stood before it, murmuring in hushed, reverent tones. A man with a tweed coat and impressive side whiskers was explaining it to his 2 young sons, pointing to the different scripts. And this man in France, Champollion, he said, his voice carrying in the quiet hall, a brilliant fellow, they say. Used this very stone to unlock the whole lot. Imagine. I stood at the back of the crowd, feeling like an eavesdropper at my own family's reunion. This was my stone. I had watched the soldiers dig it from the rubble. I had breathed the dust it shed. I had watched my father's hands, white with chalk from the rubbings, hover over its surface with a love that was almost holy. And now here it was, an exhibit, a numbered object in a foreign collection, its story being told by an Englishman. When the family moved on, I stepped closer. I stood before it for a long time, so long that one of the museum guards began to watch me with a placid curiosity. I looked at the 3 scripts. The hieroglyphs at the top, which were no longer just pictures but a readable text about tax exemptions and the divine cult of a young king. The flowing demotic in the middle. And at the bottom, the Greek, the familiar letters that had been my father's entry point, his thread in the labyrinth. It was magnificent. It was a triumph of the human mind. It was everything my father had dreamed it would be. And yet, I felt a strange and hollow disappointment. This stone, the one that could now tell the world the official histories of Ptolemaic kings, could not tell me what I most wanted to know. It couldn't tell me what the air felt like on the day it was carved. It couldn't describe the calloused hands of the men who had etched its surface. It couldn't tell me if Yusef had ever married, or if his children now fished in the same canals we had. The stone spoke of kings and priests, of decrees and dynasties. It was the history of the powerful. Instinctively, my hand went to my pocket and closed around the small, smooth river stone. I pulled it out, keeping it shielded in my palm. It was gray and warm from my body. I looked from the famous, world-changing slab of black granodiorite to the insignificant pebble in my hand. And in that quiet moment, in that grand hall of empire, everything shifted into place. The Rosetta Stone was a key, yes, but a key to a specific kind of knowledge, the formal, recorded, official past. It was my father's world, a world of texts and measurements and evidence. And it was a world that had, in its own way, been conquered, catalogued, and put on display. But the pebble in my hand was a key to a different kind of knowledge. It unlocked the memory of a shared laugh, the feeling of sun-warmed dust, the simple, unspoken understanding between two boys. It was the key to a history that is never written down, the history of a moment, of a friendship, of a life as it is lived. That was Yosef's world. And it was mine, too. My father had chased a ghost, the voice of a dead civilization. He believed the ultimate truth was written in stone. But perhaps the truest things are more ephemeral, carried not in granite, but in the heart. Perhaps understanding a place isn't just about deciphering its ancient texts, but about learning the names of its trees, feeling its river mud between your toes, and sharing a piece of fruit with a friend. I looked at the Rosetta Stone one last time. I no longer felt the sting of loss or the bitterness of defeat. I felt a quiet sense of gratitude. I was grateful for my father's passion, for the quest that had taken me to Egypt and shown me a world of wonders. I was grateful for the stone itself, for the intellectual adventure it had launched. But I was also grateful for its loss. Because in the space left by its absence, another kind of understanding had been allowed to grow. I closed my hand around Yosef's pebble, its smooth, familiar shape a comfort against my skin. I had come to London to see the Rosetta Stone, but I had ended up finding a piece of myself. The world could have its great key to the language of the pharaohs. I had my own key, my own small, perfect stone, and it was more than enough. It spoke a language I already understood. I turned away from the display and walked out of the gallery, leaving the murmuring crowds behind. I stepped out of the museum's grand portico and into the soft London drizzle. The rain felt cool on my face. And as I walked through the grey streets of a foreign city, my mind was filled with the brilliant, searing colors of an Egyptian sun. The story was finally complete. Not the stone's story. Mine.